On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers?" And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive." Mark begins this Monday with a hungry Jesus looking for fruit on a fig tree, which he then curses for not being in fruit. We are next taken into the temple in Jerusalem, where Jesus effectively closes the place down through his driving out of commercial activity, before we return to the fig tree which has withered away to its root. It's a mistake to see these as separate incidents. Mark's Gospel often contains pairs of incidents that are intended to be interpreted in the light of one another. Mark emphasizes two seemingly contradictory elements in his account of the cursing of the fig tree. On the one hand, it was Passover week, which would have been late March or early April, when the fig tree would not have been in fruit. It was not the season for figs. On the other hand, Jesus was hungry, and having failed to find fruit, cursed the tree to permanent barrenness. This is Mark's way of warning us to treat the event symbolically rather than literally. If we take the incident literally, we see a petulant Jesus abusing his power. But taken as a parable, the fig tree's failure is a cipher for the temple. The framing fig tree warns us that the temple isn't being cleansed, but symbolically destroyed, and that, in both cases, the problem is a lack of fruit. There are some Christians who assume Jesus was objecting to blood sacrifice, although this is unlikely. From antiquity, human beings knew two basic ways of creating and maintaining relationships with one another: the gift and the meal. How then did they create, maintain, or restore good relationships with a divine being? What visible acts could they do to reach an invisible being? Again, they could give a gift or share a meal. In sacrifice as a gift, the offerer took a valuable animal or other food and gave it to God by burning it on the altar, and the smoke and the smell rising upward symbolized the transition of the gift from earth to heaven. In sacrifice as a meal, the animal was transferred to God by having its blood poured over the altar, and the meat was then returned as divine food for a sacred feast with God. Neither is about suffering or substitution. There may have been an issue with the ambiguity of the temple as both the house of God on earth and the institutional seat of submission to Rome. The temple's ambiguity goes back half a millennium to the time of the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 7, God tells Jeremiah to stand in front of the temple and confront those who enter to worship. And confront them about what? About their false sense of security. They seem to take it for granted that God's presence in the temple guarantees the security of Jerusalem and their own security too. Do you think, charges God through Jeremiah, that divine worship excuses you from divine justice, and that all God wants is a regular attendance at God's temple, rather than an equitable distribution of God's justice? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? The people's everyday injustice makes them robbers, and they think the temple is their safe house. The temple is not the place where robbery occurs, but the place where robbers go for refuge. God does not insist on justice and worship, but on justice over worship. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The temple incident involved both an action by Jesus and a teaching that accompanied and explained it. First, the action. Jesus began to drive out the buyers and sellers. He overturned the tables of the money changers. He overturned the seats of the dove sellers, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. All of these activities were perfectly legitimate and absolutely necessary for the temple's normal functioning. What does it mean then that Jesus stopped the temple's perfectly legitimate sacrificial and fiscal activities? It means that Jesus has shut down the temple, but in a symbolic rather than a literal shutdown. At this point, the mark and frames of fig tree and temple coalesce. The tree was shut down for the lack of fruit that Jesus looked for, and so also was the temple. In the case of the temple, it is not cleansing, but symbolic destruction, and the fig tree's fate emphasizes that meaning. Sadly, in much modern Christian thought, den is ignored and robbery taken to mean the commerce going on in the outer courts of the temple. This is a symbolic fulfillment of God's threat in Jeremiah. There was nothing wrong with the combination of prayer, worship, and sacrifice, for they are commanded in the Torah. This is not the problem. God is a God of justice and righteousness, and when prayer, worship, and sacrifice substitute for justice, God rejects his temple, or for us today, his church. God of Lazarus and God of Judas, your great love raises the dead and condemns what is wrong in this life. As we enter this holy, difficult week, we know we will experience pain and brokenness and hypocrisy, but also beauty and mercy and undying love. Your death made clear what must come to an end: our fear, our waste, our selfishness. Yet we rejoice that in this dying lies our rebirth, and that you will bring the world and the grace-filled good in us back to life. Amen.